of the things that is pretty indisputable about family over the past 50 years is that it has changed rather dramatically. So if we look at the 1960s until the present, we have seen some dramatic shifts in family. And one of the questions that family sociologists have been asked is family in decline or is family just changing? And people's response to that often depends on sort of their theoretical orientation or their political orientation. So what have been the major changes in families since the 1960s? Well, one of the first changes that's pretty dramatic is that people are marrying later. They used to marry in their early 20s. Now they're marrying in their later 20s, about 27 and 28 years old for women and for men. That's also led to there being more single people. There are more single people because people marry later, but there are also more single people because the divorce rate is higher than it was in the 50s. If you wait longer to get married, that may mean that you spend most of your 20s as a single person and you might live on your own. So another thing we're seeing is that household size is smaller. Household size is smaller because people get divorced and they live in a smaller household. Household size is smaller because they wait till they're older to get married. And household size is smaller because they're not having as many kids, or they're having kids later, which leads them ultimately to having fewer kids. We also see this idea of living child-free. That's kind of a new thing. Not very many women do that, but the number of people embracing that as a legitimate choice to not have children has increased dramatically. Overall, women just don't have as many kids as they used to. We've also seen more women entering the labor force full-time, getting more education. So the number of women who are stay-at-home moms has changed dramatically. So the family really doesn't look like it did in the 1950s, right? When you had this model of a paid labor force father with a stay-at-home mom and 4 or 5 kids. We don't look like that at all anymore. Another thing that we've seen is increasing attention paid to violence within families, whether it's domestic violence or child abuse. Families probably were more violent in the past. The extreme forms of violence, I would argue, are less common, but our society's willingness to acknowledge them and try to remedy them through things like opening domestic violence shelters, that's more common nowadays than it was in the past. Another trend would be an increase in intermarriage. We're seeing more people intermarry. It's still a small percentage of the population, but the number of people doing it is more than in the past. I want to talk a little bit more about the divorce rate. The divorce rate has been declining since 1982. However, what happened is the divorce rate increased rather dramatically in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, and then it has sort of slowly fallen off. So while the divorce rate's lower than it was in the 90s, we're nowhere near where we were in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. The divorce rate is much higher than it was during that period. And there's 4 major reasons cited for an increase in divorce over this time frame. One is increasing expectations of marriage. People expect to get a lot more out of marriage. They want a soulmate, and they end up getting someone who's just as imperfect as they are. The increasing independence of women has changed marriage. That causes some couples to kind of argue about who's supposed to do what around the house, or they're not comfortable with women in the labor force or some of the power that has been gained by women. But also women now, because we have our own education and in many cases our own careers, we can leave marriages that we find unfulfilling or abusive, or when we have partners who are absent or not helpful or unkind to us, whereas in the past we did not have the opportunity to do that. The last thing that has really, or the last 2 things that have really driven this trend in increasing divorce are changes in the laws. It's now easier to get a divorce than it used to be. We started that in California in the 1970s with what they call no-fault divorce laws, where you no longer had to sue your spouse to get married or get divorced. You could both go in and agree that you had these irreconcilable differences and that you wanted to separate, and you could create what we now call an uncontested divorce. And that's made it easier for people to get divorced. Some people think that's bad. I'm actually a little more inclined to think that's not a bad change. And the last thing that's led to more divorce is changes in the social stigma. We We don't stigmatize divorced people like we used to. You don't have a big scarlet D on your chest saying, oh my God, you're divorced. We look at it as sort of a part of life, something that happens, not ideal, but something that occurs. So overall, those four things are what has driven the divorce rate higher. Again, it's starting to come down, and that's partly because people are just not marrying at the rate they used to, and it's also because they're marrying later, and we're getting people who are more selected for successful marriages, meaning they have more education, they have higher incomes, they're a little bit older. All those factors are driving the divorce rate down, but also they're driving the number of people marrying down. Because we have more divorce, we also have more remarriage, and that leads to more of what we call blended families and step families. We also have more single parents because of divorce and because people have children when they've never been married to their child's other parent. And so the number of single parents is much, much higher than it used to be. And that's partly, again, due to divorce and due to non-marital childbearing. Right now, between 40 and 45% of children are born to an unmarried mother. Now, she could be cohabiting, living with the father, but she's not married to them. Cohabitation is another thing that we should talk about as a big social change. Half of couples now live with each other before they're married. In many cases, cohabitation is considered, just a step that's a little between marriage and dating, whereas it used to be thought of as this bad thing. You were shacking up, you were living in sin. Now we view cohabitation, living together as a couple without being married, as a sort of normal thing, and it doesn't have the stigma that it used to have. We're also seeing an increase of acceptance of LGBTQIA couples and relationships and families. We're seeing an acceptance of sort of different types of definitions of marriage. Things like open marriages are now a topic of discussion. And one last trend that's a little more distressing, I think, than some of the others is an increase in grandparents raising their grandchildren. You see more and more children, whether the parents are incarcerated or have died of like suicide or opioids. You're seeing a lot of grandparents raising those children. And I don't mean grandparents raising their grandchildren with the parents living in their home. I mean grandparents who have the primary responsibility of raising their grandchildren. And so there have been a lot of major shifts. I'm only getting into some of them. There are others we could talk about, but these are some major trends that have occurred in families. And so when we go back and we visit the theoretical perspectives, you should think about whether or not a functionalist or a conflict theorist or a symbolic interactionist or a feminist or an exchange theorist would think of these changes as a positive thing or a negative thing or just a natural evolution in how families operate. I know over the years many people have been very distressed about these changes. I would offer that not everyone sees these changes as distressing, and you should think about what theoretical perspectives might feel sort of negatively towards the changes and which ones might feel more positive towards those changes.